Fire Emblem Sacred Stones is widely considered to be one of the easiest games in the entire series. And as you might expect, this has led players to do all sorts of crazy challenge runs over the years. Recently, some creators like Excelblum and Akira have even gone as far as completing zero stat runs, where they pick an important stat, usually something like strength or speed, and then set both the bases and growths for that stat to 0 on all their units. But that's just one stat. What if instead you were to do that for all of your stats? Would beating the game even be possible anymore? Well, in this video, that's exactly what I'll be trying to answer. And with that, let me introduce you to my Fire Emblem Sacred Stones Zero Bases and Growths playthrough. I hope you enjoy. Now before we can get started, I'd like to quickly go over the official rules I gave myself for the run, just so we're all on the same page. 1. All growth rates are set to 0%. This is pretty straightforward, nothing new here. This just removes the ability for any of my units to gain stats through level ups. 2. All base stats, except for HP and Constitution, are set to 0. For HP and Constitution, units are instead given their class bases. This was not a decision that was easy to make, but one that I ultimately felt would be for the better. For HP, you can't really set the stat to 0, and as you'll soon see, with no defense or resistance, most units just get one-rounded or one-shot anyways, so in practice it doesn't really make that much of a difference, but there are a few scenarios where it comes in handy. For Constitution, there are some factors beyond just your attack speed that it affects that I think are much more important to preserve. Most notably the Rescue and Aid formula, which gets absolutely broken with 0 con. 3. The game must be played on difficult mode. Since we're already making the game much harder by removing all base stats and growths, we might as well just go all the way and pick the hardest difficulty too. And with that, we're ready to start the run. I load up a new game, and immediately learn why other players have limited themselves to removing only one stat from the game at a time. Both Erica and Seth immediately get doubled and one-rounded by the very first enemies in the game. Even Seth, the god himself, is no match for this random enemy fighter. It quickly became clear to me that trying to beat this challenge through conventional means was going to be pretty unrealistic. If I wanted to have even the slightest chance at beating this, there would have to be some RNG shenanigans involved. So I pulled out the Lewis script that I'd used to rig the RNG for my FE8 LTC, and proceeded to spend an entire hour burning RNs to rig the dodges required just to beat the Prologue. This was both tedious and mind-numbingly boring, and I pretty quickly began to doubt if I'd even want to continue the run at all. But then, it hit me. I suddenly remembered a video by Mecha that I'd seen a few months back that used something called a perfect luck patch that always rigged the RNG in the player's favor. This was a patch made by Skryza for FE7, and while I eventually discovered that it couldn't directly be applied to FE8, I realized I might be able to make my own patch that does the same thing. At the time of recording this, I'm currently a senior in college studying computer engineering, so I actually felt pretty comfortable with the level of programming required to mod the GBA games. For the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail about how I got it to work, but I eventually came up with a patch that simulates perfect luck. It basically works as follows. During combat, if you're not a red enemy unit and you have a hit rate that's greater than 0, round your hit rate up to 100. Conversely, if you're an enemy unit who has a hit rate that's less than 100, round your hit rate down to 0. The same logic is also applied to crit rates. In effect, this means that anytime a non-enemy unit has a chance to hit or crit, they always will. And if an enemy isn't guaranteed to hit or crit, they always won't. So, let's add a quick addendum to the rule set. 4. The perfect luck patch can be used to guarantee that a non-enemy unit will always hit or crit if they have a chance to, and enemies will always miss or not crit if they're not guaranteed to do so. While this may sound like a really overpowered tool, the run is still far from easy, as you'll soon see. It does, however, make it much more bearable. My main objective with this run is to simply prove it's possible, So by simulating perfect RNG, I can save myself dozens of hours of what I'd otherwise have to manually rig. Anyways, with all that out of the way, we can finally, actually get started. With the perfect luck patch installed, we were finally ready to take on the Prologue, and the difference was night and day. None of the enemies could hit me anymore, and Erica always crits with her rapier. Suddenly, there was hope. The challenge actually started to feel doable. Easy even. And then I reached the Chapter 1 boss, Baguette. Mr. Baguette, usually a pretty trivial boss, posed a significant challenge to our baseless, growthless scrubs, even with the perfect luck patch rigging things in our favor. This is where I first realized how important managing the weapon triangle was going to be in this run. In Sacred Stones, having weapon triangle advantage gives you an extra 15 hit and 1 attack, while being at a disadvantage makes you lose 15 hit and 1 attack. This meant that any enemy with at least 85 hit would be guaranteed to land their attacks if they had weapon triangle advantage. And what do you know? Our buddy, Mr. Baguette, just so happens to have weapon triangle advantage over and can exactly one-shot the only unit who can do meaningful damage to him, Erica. I was initially hoping she'd be able to one-shot him with a triple effective rapier crit, but this unfortunately only does 18 damage, while our Mr. Baguette over here has 21 health and will always one-shot her on the counter. Our next best option for damage, Silverlance Seth, only does 2 damage per attack, which the boss can easily shrug off with the gate healing he gets every turn. I was, however, thankfully able to come up with a kill eventually. By having Seth fight Baguette twice, once on enemy phase and then again on the next player phase, you can completely bypass that gate healing and chip him down to 17 HP, allowing Erica to just barely finish him off with a rapier crit. With that, the chapter was over, but I was already starting to see just how difficult this run was going to be. Thankfully, we got a bit of a break over the next few chapters, as we were up against the much less accurate axe-wielding brigands, who are all completely incapable of hitting any of our units. Something worth noting though are the many units that we get during these chapters. Before even starting the run, I had made sure to do some long-term planning and some combat calculations just to see if, hitting certain benchmarks and killing some of the tougher late-game bosses was even possible, as well as making decisions around stat booster investment and promotions. During planning, I actually realized that the trainees, who are usually seen as, some of the weaker units in the cast, actually have a lot going for them in this run. Apart from having access to some great classes and utility, they also have the unique advantage of being able to promote twice instead of just once. Promotion bonuses, along with stat boosters and supports, are one of only a very limited set of ways in which we can actually make our unit stronger, so being able to take advantage of them twice is pretty nice. Ross in particular has a lot of unique qualities working in his favor that, in my opinion, made him an excellent carry for this run. Not only does Ross get to promote twice like the other trainees, but he also gets an innate crit boost by promoting into Berserker, which synergizes really well with the perfect luck patch, allowing him to crit pretty much everything after promotion. Along with using axes, the strongest weapon type in the game, he's also one of the earliest units to have access to good supports, which, like I mentioned earlier, are another super useful way to boost a unit's power. Not only can supports give units a much needed attack and crit boost, but they can also increase their avoid, allowing them to dodge some attacks that would otherwise always land. With all this in mind, I immediately made both promoting Ross and building a support with Garcia my top priority. Apart from Ross, we got a few more useful units during these chapters. Garcia, while not quite as strong as Ross, also benefits from their mutual support and can use axes. In Chapter 4, we get Archer and Loot, 2 magic users that have pretty decent combat potential since they can hit on enemy res, which is typically much lower than defense. Archer in particular also gets innate crit from light tomes, and while they typically have less might than animatomes, the consistent crits almost always make up for this. I did have plans to use Loot as well, but pretty quickly discovered that I'd somehow managed to give her 31 magic instead of 0 in FE Builder, and had to permanently bench her. Whoops. After coasting through the last few chapters, We hit another pretty big difficulty spike in Chapter 5. Not only are there plenty of enemies that can reach the 100 hit threshold with weapon triangle advantage, but there are also a bunch of brigands running around trying to destroy all the villages scattered throughout the map. Since successfully visiting all the villages nets you an early guiding ring, which I could use to promote Archer, I knew that I absolutely had to find a way to quickly get through the map and stop the brigands in time. Thankfully, spending the time to get Ross promoted to Pirate and building his Garcia support in the previous chapter immediately paid off, as he was able to pull off a massive crit sweep and clear out the central part of the map almost single-handedly. With the help of our lovely new recruit Natasha, I was then able to easily recruit Joshua, who, as a result of having no bases and being a victim of the perfect luck patch, couldn't touch any of our units. In the meantime, I sent Vanessa on a solo mission to grab the northern villages, and quickly sent my other units to take care of the rest. This let me successfully visit all the villages before the last wave of brigands even spawned, at which point the map was basically over. Chapter 5X introduces us to even more units, most of which will be joining the army permanently. Most notably, we get my boy Ephraim. Apart from having one of the coolest designs of the GBA lords, he also comes equipped with his signature weapon, the Regent Leaf. While Ephraim unfortunately still suffers from a serious case of chronic stat deficiency, the Regent Leaf does not. In fact, its innate crit and 10 might, which gets boosted up to 30 might against armored and horseback enemies, is strong enough to make Ephraim a pretty competent combat unit for most of the game. In addition to our new units, Chapter 5X also introduces us to something that had soon become a pretty common theme during this challenge. Enemies that naturally have over 100 hit that can't be negated through the weapon triangle. Just as I was getting accustomed to properly utilizing the weapon triangle to avoid attacks, suddenly I was facing enemies where that just wouldn't work. So, I was forced to come up with a few workarounds. For the mage in the chest room right at the start, my solution was to simply oak home with a Regent Leaf crit, but for the other magic and bow users later in the map, I had to stop to quickly grind out a support level between Ephraim and Ford just to get enough avoid to dodge their attacks. On the other hand, the boss, Zonta, was probably the easiest enemy on the map to kill. Between his inaccurate steel blade and the avoid boosting pillars adjacent to him, our squad effortlessly made short work of him. Now back with Erica's group, Chapter 6 proved to be pretty uneventful. There was an early reset after Ross got clapped by an extremely accurate merc, and another where I decided to reset after failing to get the droppable halberd, but apart from that, the map was pretty trivial, as Ross continued to kill everything on his crit sweeping arc. In Chapter 7, I got another taste of what would soon become a common theme in the mid-game, as Vanessa got one-rounded by a random merc despite having weapon triangle advantage. In vanilla Sacred Stones, mercenaries can be pretty threatening with their abnormally high skill and speed, but this is usually offset at least a bit by their slightly lower strength, and the fact that they're stuck using relatively weak one-range swords. However, in a run where none of your units really have any avoid and can't survive any attacks, fast mercs running around with these super accurate iron swords are terrifying. I was eventually able to get their hit rates under 100, but only by fighting them with weapon triangle advantage while also standing on a forest. And then we were at Chapter 8, where we could finally reunite with Ephraim. From a cursory glance, this chapter initially looked quite daunting. It has a wide variety of enemies with varying stat spreads and weapon types, including some super accurate Myrmidons and Mercs. By this point, however, we'd had plenty of time to build up our units and could finally start reaping the fruits of our labor. Archer got promoted to Bishop back in Chapter 7, giving him a massive +2 magic that would effectively translate to an extra 6 damage on every attack that crits. Ross, now getting +3 attack from his ace support with Garcia, continued to crit sweep everything on the map as we made our way towards the boss, Torado. While Erica's group made their way up the right side of the map, Ephraim's group also carved a path up the left side, eventually rejoining our main force near the throne room. As I approached Torado and got ready to end the map, I decided I wanted to show off a bit and let Ephraim solo the boss with animations on, so we could see his awesome crit animation as he obliterated Torado with the Regent Leaf. And then, Torado decided to be a funny guy and immediately proc Great Shield just to spite me. Even though he knew he had no chance of winning, sporting a pitiful 0 hit, he still had to be a dick about it. Fucking classic. After regaining my composure and finishing the job, we finally reached the route split, and I of course choose to go Ephraim route because I've Stockholm Syndrome myself into loving it after spending literally dozens of hours on it for my LTC. I do genuinely like a lot of the maps though, and I know them a lot better than Erica route, so I felt much more comfortable in my ability to beat them. Or so I thought. In comes Chapter 9, which was, like I knew it was going to be one of the more difficult maps going into it, but I never expected it to be this bad. I was able to get through the first part of the map on my first attempt without too many issues. It was only after reaching the main hallway that things started to get ugly. Upon entering the hall, Ross instantly got one-shot by a steel sword wielding merc, even with his full avoid boosting Garcia support. On my second attempt, I played much more carefully around the steel sword mercs and the very accurate fire wielding mages, and was able to make it past the big hallway without too much trouble. I then carefully made my way towards the throne room, taking special precautions around the northern merc and all the cavalier reinforcements, and just as I was about to enter the throne room, I made a grave mistake. Now, up until this point, pretty much every archer on the map that I'd faced had been equipped with a steel bow or a longbow, neither of which could hit any of my units, and I just assumed the very last archer in the throne room wouldn't be any different. Oh, how wrong I was. This archer just so happened to have a short bow, which, unlike steel bows and longbows, is actually quite accurate, allowing him to one-round Ephraim and force me to do it all over again. In this challenge, you really can't afford to make any mistakes. It isn't like playing the game normally, where you might slip up and theoretically expose a unit to a risk of death, but still have a chance to get lucky and tank or dodge your way through. In this challenge, any mistake is immediately met with death and a forced reset. After playing through the entire map all over again, I finally made my way back to the throne room, and the only thing standing in my way was the boss, Geb. I'd actually just promoted Ross to Berserker using the ocean seal you get earlier in the map, so surely Ross easily takes him out, right? Right? Well, as it turns out, this nightmare of a map had one last trick up its sleeve, right at the end. Upon reaching Geb, I was horrified to discover that I couldn't damage him at all. My highest damage dealer, Ross, just barely falls short of having enough attack to damage Geb, and, thanks to the good old throne bonuses, none of my magical attackers could damage him either. Well, I guess that's it. Run over, can't be beaten. Unfortunate. Just don't look at how much time's left in the video, and we can all go about our day, content with having answered our big question. I'm kidding, of course. There was no way I was going to give up that easily. Much like when I faced a similar dilemma in the prologue, I immediately began trying to think of ways to work around it, and I had a realization. While I had already rigged perfect luck for hit and crit, there was one area where I could still rig perfect luck: skill procs. More specifically, Pierce procs. Sacred Stones is a game with a pretty impactful skill system, albeit a very limited one. We already saw Torado's little Great Shield stunt earlier, and in the future we'll be seeing the Slayer skill go crazy on some of the late game monsters. But right now let's focus on Pierce. Pierce is a skill unique to the Wyvern Knight class, and it completely ignores the enemy's defenses when it procs. And as it just so happens, we'd just gotten an Elysian Whip in the previous chapter, something that would allow us to promote a Pegasus Knight into that very same class. With this in mind, I quickly grinded Tana up to level 10 on one of the archers, allowing a nearby priest to heal them after every few attacks, and got her promoted to Wyvern Knight. But I wasn't done quite yet. The probability of proccing Pierce is level percent, so Tana would start out with only a 1% chance to proc it with each attack, and she'd need multiple to kill Geb. So the wheels in my head started turning, and, given my previous exploits in modding the game, I figured I'd be able to come up with a patch that would ensure Pierce procs, much like I'd already done for hits and crits. I ended up settling on a slightly sloppy but pretty easy to implement solution where I just made it so that every Wyvern Knight, no matter what army, always procs Pierce, which I was then able to use to easily take down Geb. Now, understanding how powerful Pierce is, I chose to create an entirely separate ROM with the patch installed, and decided to only use it when absolutely necessary. I know this challenge is more about seeing if beating the game's possible, so it shouldn't really matter, but I felt like leaning on Pierce any more than this would make the rest of the playthrough pretty bland. since it essentially allows you to avoid the main difficulties that having 0 strength creates. So I quickly switched back to the Pierceless ROM and left the absolute nightmare that was Chapter 9 in the past. Chapter 10 is our first defend map, and while on paper simply beating the map is pretty easy, there's a lot more going on that makes it much more complicated. In some ways, it's actually kind of similar to Chapter 5, in that there are a lot of optional yet important side objectives that have some added time pressure as an incentive. Instead of bandits coming to destroy villages, this time our main challenge is to reach and kill 2 cavaliers that drop really strong weapons before the map ends. While this may sound pretty trivial, between the 10-turn limit and the hordes of scary merc reinforcements that spawn for 6 consecutive turns as the map progresses, this would actually prove to be a pretty difficult goal to achieve. It took a lot of experimentation and some silly resets, but I was eventually able to come up with a winning strategy. The first few turns were spent carefully taking out the 2 mercs that start in the northern half of the map, and then rushing towards the southern half of the map in time to recruit Cormag and start blocking off the continuous merc reinforcements. After getting a bit of breathing room from the mercs, I then rescue dropped a green unit onto one of the 1-tile wide bridge choke points, freeing up Ross to start killing the mercs, and, eventually, the 2 weapon-dropping calves. In the meantime, I sent Vanessa on a little side mission to visit the Hero Crest village, and then go kill the ballista boat that drops a secret book, which is a stat booster that typically isn't too important, but I knew might come in handy later. With all that done, I had successfully obtained all the optional items available, and after nearly having a heart attack when the boss attacked Ross in the very last turn, the map was over. After Chapter 10, I took my first trip to the Tower of Volney. I haven't really discussed it up until this point, but I'm going to be using the Tower of Volney to grind out things like promotions, supports, and weapon ranks. One rule I do have, however, is that I'm unable to use any items that I find during the grind. This stops me from endlessly farming things like stat boosters, which would kind of defeat the whole purpose of the run. During this trip, I promoted Amelia up to General for the juicy promo bonuses, Garcia to Hero, and Cormag to Wyvern Knight. I also got some of their supports going, and grinded each of them up to S rank in their relevant weapon types. With my newly promoted units, it was time to take on the next chapter, Phantom Ship, which was surprisingly pretty chill, although the first few turns proved to be a bit tricky. My initial plan was to do the LTC strat and drop Amelia off on the other boat on turn 2, which would allow her to pull off a massive crit sweep with a steel axe before the enemies could even reach our boat. However, I soon realized that this exposed her to some bonewalkers that could reach 100 hit, so I pretty quickly had to ditch this plan. It ended up being much safer to just slow down, clear out some of the nearby gargoyles in the first few turns, and then take advantage of avoid boosting supports to much more safely clear out the enemy boat after they dock next to ours. After dealing with the initial horde of enemies, killing the remaining flyers, reinforcements, and even the boss was pretty free. Much like Chapter 11, Chapter 12 ended up being fairly easy. At this point, I was finally starting to get used to diligently checking enemy ranges, weapon types, and base hit rates, and then adjusting my plans accordingly, so having to reset to a unit dying from some dumb mistake was becoming increasingly rare. While there are some threatening enemies on the map, they were by far the exception and not the rule, and I faced very little resistance as I made my way towards the boss. Upon killing the boss, we received a shiny new toy for Ross, the Sword Slayer. After that, it was finally time for my beloved Chapter 13. After spending far too many hours cooking up a 3-turn clear in my FE8 LTC, this chapter holds a very special place in my heart, so I felt like it was my duty to come up with a solid clear for this map. My first few attempts were a bit scuffed, but I was eventually able to come up with a decent strategy. It mainly revolved around sending Cormag, Tana, and Dusel into the center of the map to engage the many enemies surrounding the central island. Since Dusel and Tana had full supports with Cormag, he was able to go to town and take down Selena before she could burn through all of her bolting uses, and equip her much more accurate and deadly L-Fire tome. After that, I quickly cleared out most of the remaining enemies, and as I prepared to take the last few down and finish the map, it happened again. I grew complacent, and in a moment of weakness, I slipped up. On the very last enemy phase, before I'd be able to finish routing the map, my heart sank as I watched Archer get fucking owned by an L-Fire mage. While I'd become accustomed to managing the weapon triangle for most physical weapon types, the lack of magical enemies, both in my army and the enemies, meant that I never really had to do the same for the magic triangle, and I finally got punished for it. This was devastating. This was by far the most painful reset I'd had up until this point. And it wasn't just because it was my best attempt yet. It wasn't because I'd just thrown the last 40 minutes of my life down the drain. It was a much deeper pain, an existential dread. Chapter 13 was my map. If there was one chapter, one clear I wanted to be proud of, it was this one. And I'd just thrown it all away in an instant and made a fool of myself. After that, did I even deserve to continue the run? Was I just wasting my time with this? No. This wasn't the time to start doubting myself. This wasn't the time to give up. I knew I could do better. And so, with a new resolve, I prepared to give it another go. I began diligently studying my previous attempts to see what I did wrong, and started looking into what I could do better next time. Soon, I was ready to resume my attempts at clearing the chapter, this time with a brand new approach. I started by sending Ross down the middle with a Silver Axe equipped, which gave him just enough attack to one-shot all the calves with a crit. Meanwhile, I had Cormag, Tana, and Dusel approach Selena's group exactly like in the previous strat. The rest of our army was split into two groups. On the left, we had Amelia, Archer, and Ewan, and rushing over to support Garrick and Tethys on the right were Seth and Ephraim. As the map progressed, Garrick, having just promoted into a hero, used his new water walking abilities to take care of that pesky little mage that had made a fool of me in the past. After such a strong start, the rest of the pieces all slowly started to fall into place. Before I knew it, there were only a few enemies left, and then the map was over. Finally, I had come out on top, victorious, having restored my dignity. Next up, we have Chapter 14, Grotto Keep, which is a chapter that I typically don't have too much trouble with. As long as you go into it with the right strategy and plan around the reinforcements and status stabs, it usually isn't too bad, in my experience. But let me tell you, I did not go into this chapter with the right strategy this time around. My overall strategy was fairly similar to what I always tend to do. Send all my units up the left side in one big group, and spam Restore to negate any status stabs that the enemies hit. Everything actually went pretty well for most of the map. It was only when I started approaching the throne room when tragedy struck. You see, in all my planning, there was one little thing I'd neglected to account for. What do I do if my Restore user gets hit with a status staff? I was already fairly confident that Archer wouldn't get targeted by Sleep or Berserk, since he was surrounded by far juicier targets. But I'd completely forgotten about the Bishop wielding a Silent Staff on the other side of the map. Typically, in a standard playthrough, your main staff users have way too much resistance to get targeted or hit by silence, so I'd completely wiped this Bishop's existence from my mind. Now, I was forced to watch in horror as Archer got silenced and my lone summon was berserked, now with no one to restore them. After that, it was over. Not only does my own army benefit from the perfect luck patch, even while berserked, but the summon in particular has better stats than most of my units. It was only a matter of time until the summon finally decided to walk on over to Tethys and one-shot her with a crit, ending that attempt and forcing me to redo the entire map all over again. On my second attempt, I made sure to properly deal with the Silence Bishop, which I was able to do by baiting him into silencing La Rochelle instead of Archer, and then sending Ross over to one-shot him. After that, it was smooth sailing, and before I knew it, I was getting ready for another one of my favorite maps, Scorched Sand. Chapter 15, Scorched Sand, represents another significant difficulty spike for the next few chapters, even in comparison to Chapter 14, and as such, is one of my favorites to plan out. There are side objectives spread throughout the map in the form of really powerful items that are concealed as hidden treasure. There are dozens of enemies with various stat spreads and weapon types that you need to route, including some pretty strong promoted enemies and super bulky wyverns. There's even some time pressure in the form of turn-based reinforcements that encourage you to try to beat the map at a much faster pace. And finally, to top it all off, the map is covered in sand, which makes it even more difficult to reach all the enemies and hidden treasure in time to avoid the reinforcements. And I don't like the sand. Needless to say, this chapter proved to be pretty challenging in this run. My initial strategy revolved around dealing with the chapter's two bosses, Kalak and Valter. Kalak in particular looked pretty difficult to take out. He's fairly bulky and dodgy, which is only increased further by the 40 stands on, and he naturally has over 100 hit. At first, I thought Ross with the triple effective Sword Slayer would be perfect for the job, but quickly realized that he was much better suited for the larger group of enemies surrounding Valter. Since he couldn't crit Kalak anyways, Amelia actually ended up being able to do the job fairly well, albeit at a much slower pace. With this new strategy, I was able to make short work of the two bosses and the enemies surrounding them, but in the process, managed to completely disregard the northern part of the map, which resulted in the somewhat funny situation where all the Pegasus reinforcements, the Mercs, and the Berserker had Inez completely surrounded as he fought for his life from the gate of Johanna Hall. While my initial reaction to seeing this, after I got done laughing, was to want to rush in and kill them before the massive turn 8 reinforcements appeared, at this point I was over an hour into the attempt and I really didn't want to risk a reset, so I ended up playing it safe and carefully routed the rest of the map. And with that, we were getting ready to enter what is, in my opinion, one of the most fun parts of any Sacred Stones playthrough, the late game. After Chapter 15, not only do the chapters and bosses found therein continue the trend of getting increasingly more difficult, but you also get many more options for dealing with them. You get access to Warp, the Boots, and Legendary weapons, all of which can be leveraged to come up with some pretty fun strategies, starting with Chapter 16. Chapter 16 is another big Castle Seas map with some enticing loot, although there was really only one item that I actually cared about getting, the Purge Tome that one of the Sage reinforcements drops. Not only is this 10-range Siege Tome really handy for killing eggs in Chapter 18, but it boasts a disgusting 30 might when used against monsters by a bishop with the Slayer skill. This, plus its inherent crit, means that if used properly, it becomes a quite potent 10-range nuke. As such, my strategy for this chapter was almost entirely centered around killing the Purge Sage before they had a chance to use it and drop their Divine Tome instead. The Sage reinforcements only spawn upon entering the main hall in front of the throne room, so I had all the time in the world to set my units up to kill them the moment they spawned. Due to how the reinforcement zone is laid out, I was able to accomplish this by warping in both Ross and Garcia and getting them into position on a couple pillars before triggering the reinforcements. This allowed Ross to immediately Garm crit the Sage and nab their Purge Tome right as they appeared. After achieving my only goal for this chapter, finishing everything else up proved to be pretty trivial. While getting the Purge Tome in Chapter 16 forced me to slow down a bit, I was ready to go into full LTC mode for the next few maps, starting with Chapter 17. Since the boss, Leon, gets weighed down to only 2 attack speed by Fenrir, Ross was actually able to double him after getting Garm's +5 speed bonus. In fact, Ross could even one-round Leon with Garm, as long as Garcia was nearby to give him an extra +3 attack from their support. This then allowed me to cook up a neat little 2-turn clear. I'd start by having Tana, who now had 10 move thanks to using the boots, drop Garcia off over by Leon. I'd then have Ardor warp Ross over to Leon, who he'd now be able to one-round thanks to his Garcia support. In the meantime, Mur would fly over and one-shot a hero to grab his droppable Brave Axe, which I figured might be nice to have at our disposal for future chapters. After successfully executing my plan, we were rewarded with a couple more legendary weapons, most notably the Vidofnir, which both Cormag and Tana would start making extensive use of. Next up was Chapter 18, which posed some unique challenges for our baseless, growthless army. With Chapter 18, the name of the game tends to be movement over combat, and it was especially true in this run. Most of the monsters on the map are actually pretty inaccurate and pose little threat to our units, with a huge exception being the Gorgons. While there are only a few that actually start on the map, if any were allowed to hatch from their eggs, things could go south very quickly. On top of this, the eggs actually become kinda tough to kill once they start hatching, so reaching and taking them out as soon as possible was extremely important. Now before we go any further, I'd like to take a quick moment to explain a neat little discovery I made while attempting this chapter. So, the Gorgon eggs we have to prevent from hatching are already kinda hard for us to kill at base. They have 10 defense and res, so even when they haven't started hatching, and still only have 5 HP, a lot of our army actually struggles to do meaningful damage to them. Now consider how much harder it is to kill them after they've started hatching and gaining another 5 HP every single turn. My initial workaround for this was to simply leverage effective damage from legendary weapons and the Bishop Slayer skill. What I soon learned, however, was that hatching eggs don't actually count as monsters. Upon noticing this, I was beyond shocked. At first, I didn't really believe it and kinda just assumed that I must have inadvertently messed something up with the ROM through my various modding exploits. But then I went and tested it on a clean ROM afterwards, and was able to confirm that, unfortunately, it's canon. That's right. Base eggs that haven't started hatching? Monsters. Hatched eggs? Also monsters. But eggs that are in the process of hatching? Not monsters. Whether this was a design oversight, or just the devs doing a bit of trolling, remains unknown. But either way, it made this chapter much more difficult than it should have been. After making some adjustments to account for this game mechanic, I actually ended up being able to get through the rest of the map relatively unscathed. As it turns out, legendary weapons have enough might to not really care about monster effectiveness, at least when it comes to eggs. There was a bit of a jump scare towards the end of the map when I realized that an enemy had over 100 hit on Tana and could easily kill her, but I completely lucked out and had the enemy attack a summon instead. I assume the AI chose to do this because the summon had lower defenses, even though it still had a guaranteed kill on Tana and not the summon, but honestly, who cares? Even if Tana definitely should have died on multiple occasions, I'll take it. Before starting Chapter 19, we made a quick little stop at a skirmish to do one thing and one thing only. Grind up Natasha to B staves so she could use rescue. After the first Volney trip, I stopped explicitly mentioning grinding sessions, but this one was a bit special. I'm always looking for an excuse to give Natasha some love, so although I hadn't completely planned out the next couple of chapters yet, I knew I'd probably need at least one more rescue user, and figured it'd be the perfect opportunity to get her in on the action. And with that, we were finally ready to take on Chapter 19, which I was actually really looking forward to coming up with a clear for. In casual or efficient playthroughs, you can pretty easily just warp over to the boss and immediately kill him, which ends the map early. Going into this chapter, I assumed I'd be able to do something pretty similar, but quickly ran into some issues. While getting Ross over to the boss was trivial, actually killing him was a completely different story. There were a few things in particular about the boss, Reeve, that made him quite difficult to take down. First, he's surprisingly bulky for a magic user, boasting a whopping 51 HP and 16 defense, meaning that one-shotting him with a Garm crit was off the table. To make matters worse, he also comes equipped with the incredibly accurate Aura Tome, giving him 139 hit, which was far too high for even Ross with maxed out Avoid to dodge. In fact, anyone that had to face an attack from Reeve was all but guaranteed to die. So I immediately started racking my brain trying to find a way to kill him without taking a counter, and soon enough, I had it. As it turns out, there was one tool I had at my disposal that I'd completely neglected up until this point. The Eclipse Tome that I'd gotten all the way back in Chapter 15. Eclipse is a pretty unique tome, in that it always halves the enemy's HP if it lands, regardless of their defensive stats. This was huge. There was only one problem. To balance out this pretty broken effect, Eclipse has one of the most atrocious hit rates in the game, having only 30 hit at base. I quickly realized that even getting someone to have the minimum 1 hit required to allow us to land Eclipse on Reeve might actually prove to be a challenge. So once again, I started cooking up a plan. Reeve has 35 Avoid at base, and gets another 15 from having Weapon Triangle advantage over Dark Tomes, giving him a total of 50 Avoid. This meant that I needed someone to have at least 51 hit to be able to land Eclipse. And my options for doing this were pretty limited. My only dark magic users were Ewan and Null, and neither generally had great skill or hit supports. And then it hit me. There were tons of stat boosters that I had been hoarding throughout the game for this exact kind of situation. Sure enough, I had 2 secret books sitting in the convoy, which, along with his raw support, let Ewan get all the way up to 50 hit. But I was still 1 short. Then, I was reminded that there's another stat that influences hit rates, albeit to a much lesser extent than skill: luck. While every point of skill gives you 2 points of hit, you only get half a point of hit for each point of luck you have. But that was still enough. After giving Ewan +2 luck from our goddess icon, he was able to reach exactly 51 hit. With this new development, I finally had the boss kill figured out. Ewan would chip Reeve down to half health with Eclipse, and then Ross would get warped in to finish him off with a single Garm crit, meaning that he'd never have to take a counter. I then came up with a neat little clear that made sure to grab the Speedwings chest and make use of Natasha's newly found rescue capabilities, something that proved to be absolutely crucial to getting the clear, and was not in fact just a complete waste of time. And with that, it was finally time to enter into the last few chapters in the run. I was finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Chapter 20, on its surface, initially looked pretty daunting. There are tons of promoted enemies of varying classes and weapon types, and lots of zone-based reinforcements to back them up. The chapter also has two pretty tough bosses, Reeve, again, and the reincarnated body of the dragon Morva, both of whom have pretty respectable hit rates. As a result, I was actually kind of looking forward to playing this map out instead of simply warp skipping it like I usually do. Upon closer inspection, however, I quickly realized that the large majority of the enemies on the map had under 100 hit, either naturally or with weapon triangle disadvantage. So playing through it normally would more likely just be tedious rather than engaging. I was also able to come up with a pretty neat way to kill Morva, the only boss we actually had to kill in order to seize. By using Eclipse to chip him down to half HP with Ewan, and then finishing him off with a triple effective Purge crit from Archer, we'd be able to snipe him from complete safety halfway across the map. With this much flashier boss kill now on the table, the idea of foregoing it to instead spend ages playing through the map normally was never going to happen. Before I knew it, Morva was dead, and there was only one thing standing in our way before we could finish the run. The final chapter is split up into two parts. In the first, you have to get past an assortment of pretty powerful monsters and kill the omega bulky boss, Leon. And in the second, your only mission is to take down the final boss, the Demon King. Since I'd already done the combat calcs to make sure I could kill the Demon King before even starting the run, I spent all my time in preps planning out part 1. Despite making sure that I'd meticulously planned out the kill for the Demon King, I'd completely neglected to do any planning for Leon. While the Leon we fought in Chapter 17 was pretty weak, I mean, Ross literally one-rounded him, the Leon you fight in the final chapter is no joke. Much like the Demon King, he has some pretty insane bulk, but unlike the Demon King, we can't bank on monster-effective legendary weapons to get around it. Even a Garm crit from our strongest unit, Ross, only does 9 damage, which is pitiful in comparison to Leon's insanely high 75 HP. To make matters worse, Leon has over 140 hit with the Naglfar, which is too high for even our dodgiest units to avoid. For a moment, I thought I might have no other option but to whip out the Always Pierce patch again, and Ocomb with a Pierce crit. But then I remembered, there's another way to do consistent damage to an enemy regardless of their defensive bulk. Eclipse. With 3 Eclipse uses, I could drop Leon down to right about 9 HP, allowing me to get a clean one-shot with a Garm crit from Ross. Problem solved. With that all out of the way, it was finally time for me to actually start preparing my team for the task at hand. As I was carefully picking who to bring and giving them the strongest weapons I could, I had a fun little idea pop into my head. I noticed that I still had a few stat boosters that I'd been hoarding lying around, and instead of giving them to one of my stronger combat units like Ross, I instead decided to dump them all into the far superior Natasha. Why would I do this, you ask? Well, if you hadn't noticed, I'm just a bit biased towards Natasha, both from her performance in my reverse recruitment 0% growth run, and just generally liking her as a character. I figured that dumping a bunch of stat boosters into her, grinding her up to level 10 with Barrier, and then promoting her to Bishop with the Master Seal that you get from a chest during the final chapter, would be the perfect way to properly pay homage to my GOAT. And much like the decision to grind her up to B staves so she could use Rescue in Chapter 19, this was absolutely essential to completing the run. Trust me. And with that, it was finally time to start the chapter. As I began making my way towards Leon, things actually went really smoothly. I had to play carefully around a few enemies that could reach 100 hit with weapon triangle advantage, and a pretty scary Necro Dragon, but otherwise I ran into very few issues. As I prepared to make my final push towards Leon from the top left corner of the map, I sent Tana, who I'd given the boots, up ahead to start clearing out a path towards the boss. While Tana is, unfortunately, one of the only units in our army to consistently have 0 avoid without supports, and there were some pretty scary Shadowshot Gorgons next to Leon, I had made sure to do some quick head calcs beforehand, and had determined that none of them could reach 100 hit. Due to enemy stat variation, it was technically possible for them to reach 100 hit, but I'd made sure that none of the Gorgons had 15 or more skill, which would give them the extra 30 hit that they needed to make the 70 accuracy Shadow Shot always hit. And then I actually got in range, and Tana immediately got fucking owned anyways. Very cool. So what happened here? I was absolutely sure that I'd done my math right, so how could she get hit? Well, ironically, while it wasn't my math being wrong that got me killed, it was my failure to account for luck. Luck, which I had literally used only a few chapters earlier to give Ewan that 1 extra hit that he needed to eclipse Reeve, had completely evaded my mind when I was doing my head calcs. In a hilariously ironic twist of fate, this Gorgon had also reached the exact 100 hit threshold that they needed to kill me by having just enough luck. It was poetic. I'm not gonna lie, this one hurt. A lot. But at this point, there was nothing else I could really do besides go back and do it all over again. This time around, things were different though. I could go a bit faster since I already had my general game plan figured out, and what was even better was that after resetting my my Nintendo PC, the Shadowshot Gorgons rolled lower skill and luck, so they actually couldn't hit me this time. Hooray! I could confidently send Tana up now, right? Right? I don't even want to say what happened next. Fine. On the next attempt, I confidently sent Tana up to clear things out, and happily watched as both Gorgons tried, and failed, to land Shadow Shot. I even had a little laugh at myself for the irony of forgetting to factor in luck on my previous attempt, thinking this was all behind me. And then another Gorgon, not a Shadow Shot Gorgon, mind you, walked up to Tana and proceeded to put me right back in my place. In all my excitement from knowing that the Shadow Shot Gorgons couldn't hit me, I'd completely forgotten about the non-Shadow Shot Gorgons, who, unlike their other buddies, do actually move to attack you, and do have a weapon that's more accurate than Shadow Shot. So yeah, it was right back to square one. The next time around, I actually took care of the non-Shadow Shot Gorgons well before they could reach Tana by sniping them with Purge, and was finally able to reach Leon. It was also at this point that I managed to promote Natasha into Bishop and give her the recognition she very much deserved. After that, it was as simple as landing 3 Eclipses, and then moving in to finish off Leon with a Garm crit from Ross. Finally, things were going according to plan. With Leon dead, there was only one fight left, and then it was all over. Knowing that the Demon King is always scripted to summon monsters instead of attacking on turn 1, I started by getting all of my units into position so that I could attack with full support bonuses on the next turn. Natasha was finally able to make her key contribution to the run by rescue boosting Archer further than he'd ever be able to move with a simple rescue or warp. After watching the disgustingly slow summon animations on enemy phase, it was finally time. Ross started by chipping the Demon King down to 36 HP with 2 Garm crits, and then Myrrh swooped in to finish him off with a flashy little crit herself. And just like that, the run was over. And what a journey it was. So, looking back, were we ultimately able to accomplish what we set out to do? Did we prove that it really is possible to beat Sacred Stones when all units start with 0 base stats and have 0% growths? Well, we did end up modding the game a bit along the way. However, I would like to reiterate that none of the mods fundamentally changed how the game works. They only introduced quality of life improvements and saved dozens of hours of RNG rigging that I'd have to do otherwise. So yes, I think it's safe to say that we did in fact prove that it's technically possible to beat Sacred Stones with these restrictions. Is it realistic? Absolutely not, but it sure is possible. And I actually really enjoyed this run. It gave me an excuse to finally try out modding the games, which was something that I'd been considering doing long before I even had the idea for the run. And I ended up having a lot of fun with it. It was also really interesting having to approach the game from an entirely new perspective, and seeing what kinds of strategies and routes I had to develop as a result. Pre-promotes went from being some of the strongest units in the game to some of the weakest, and the 3 trainees, who typically tend to be viewed as quote-unquote bad units among the FE community, were now some of the strongest units in our army. They're also some of my favorite units in the game to use, so I loved finding builds and strategies that would let them excel in this unique context. More broadly speaking, there were just a lot of really unique strategies and approaches that I had to take that made the game a lot more fun and interesting than a standard playthrough. Instead of being able to just go, haha, strong unit with 2-range weapon, go burr, like you could usually do, I actually had to think ahead, look at enemy formations and weapon types, and plan my own unit positioning and weapon usage accordingly. The weapon triangle actually mattered for once. Supports were crucial for allowing units to dodge attacks and actually do meaningful damage. Some bosses and chapters that are usually super free actually became pretty difficult. This was certainly one of the most unique playthroughs of Fire Emblem I've ever done in all my time playing the series, and I don't think it'll be the last time I do something like this. Now before I sign off, I just have a few more things I'd like to say. First, I'd like to quickly thank Exublum and Acura, 2 FE tubers that weren't directly involved in this video, but helped inspire me to do this with their own zero stat runs. They aren't quite as insane as I am, so they focus on removing only 1 stat's base and growth, which still leads to some pretty interesting runs that are also a lot more realistic. But as it turns out, while I was in the process of editing this whole thing up, another player named TG was actually as insane as I am, and managed to complete a pretty similar run in Engage, which also ended up being pretty cool. So if you'd like to check out anyone I just mentioned, they'll all be linked in the description, of course. And finally, I'd like to thank you for watching. This has all taken a lot of time and effort over the past few months, so I really appreciate you sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed. If you end up liking the video, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like, and consider subscribing if you want to see more stuff like this in the future. This certainly won't be the last challenge run of a Fire Emblem game that I'll be doing, and I even have some other projects in the work at the time of recording this. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Peace.